The theme of our meeting here this year is a report from the future. And I'm really glad that that's the title, because implicit in that is that we have a future, which I think is a really important thing and was not something we would have necessarily guaranteed a few years ago. I've really enjoyed the last day and what we've had this morning. I've really been inspired and felt very hopeful. And I think a really big reason for that is that we've had so much more of a broad swathe of opinions and thought. We're going to hear more from Heather. We're going to hear from research. We've heard from researchers. We've heard from funders, technologists, and publishers. And I think having all of those people in the room and discussing these common issues that we face is really important. To help us navigate the near future of scholarly publishing, we've assembled a distinguished panel, a researcher, a technologist, and a publisher who represent three of the really crucial constituencies in scholarly publishing. We'll hear about them from them just in a minute, but we've put them in the order that we have, not just simply because it's the same as on the slide, but because that's a logical flow, at least as we do scholarly publishing now. But whether that will change in the future, how we're going to run these things a little bit differently today from yesterday, where we had a lot of very detailed presentations. This time we want to have a more relaxed, not so many slides and just a discussion. I'm going to shut up now because it's more important for our panelists to talk and for you to ask questions. So Heather, please, over to you.
Thank you. Once again, just really excited to be here and to be in discussion with you all. Thank you so much for your generosity in allowing me in. And also, too, when we were talking about forming the panel, we were thinking about slides versus not. So I have slides. I have one slide like we discussed, but it's really just recounting my background because I thought that'd be helpful for you all to keep in mind as we discuss. But from the discussions yesterday and even this morning, I really maybe want to just revisit or to introduce some questions that are on my mind, especially as we go into panel discussion. Because it comes from my background, as I mentioned, and I really love this opportunity to just be thinking with you all. So these are some things that are on my mind I might just throw out as we proceed. I want you to be really proud of the role that platforms and publications play in STEM from an aspect that you may not have really thought about, and it's in education. I mentioned this very briefly yesterday, but as we grapple with what happens to the article format, I mentioned that there's something about that format that I depend upon as an educator to bring up trainees in thinking like a scientist. And so while that's a concern, I also want you to know about that is a real kind of strength that you all play, and it's really pivotal. Actually, so when I sit down with a trainee for the first time and walk them through references and how to think backwards and forwards on citations, I sit down, I say, we are going to Web of Science. We are not going to Google Scholar. We're going to Web of Science. I want you to know that these platforms exist for facilitating this kind of thinking. It could be other platforms too, but I think it's really important for you to know that's at a practical one-to-one mentoring level that I use these tools for education. And I think it's important because this is how we think about the future of STEM. I need to produce STEM researchers in the future that will be able to have that facility with knowledge, and it's all happening through platforms when I teach it. So you should know that. You should feel proud of the role that you have and know that it really is kind of a future question as well. I also just want to throw out something that's been on my mind as I hear about these questions with AI and going for a frictionless air track system. Does anybody remember Google Wave?
Yes.
Yeah? So if you don't know about Google Wave, you can Google it. But it was basically kind of Google saying, let's kind of send messages through the air to each other and kind of seamlessly talk and collaborate. And so I was on the Prof Hacker group at the time, and we actually tried to send waves to each other, right? It was kind of a fun thing to try out. And I think Google Wave is a really interesting thing to look back on historically, to think about goals of frictionless, seamless communications that we've been talking about, what happened, what worked well. So I just want to throw that out for further discussion. I also just want to reiterate, I'm hearing from the questions that this group has on AI and publishing. I'll say it positively, there's a lot of similarities with AI of medical imaging in terms of how do we use it, when, what are the workflows, what are the tasks. I'm really struck by this in this conversation. So I want to just emphasize, wow, wouldn't it be great if we talked more? Because as I mentioned, there's decades of history of scientists working with AI of medical imaging. I said 20 years ago yesterday, but I'm proud to be at UChicago. UChicago was one of the first places to use a neural network on a medical image, and this actually happened in the late 80s, early 90s. It's gone way back. So let's talk more about the history of that and what we've learned and what you are thinking about, what you've learned. We can talk about in terms of history and principles. I think there's some neat practical tools there that I'll just throw out. Again, I just want to throw out like points for consideration and brag on a student, if you don't mind. So one of my former students, you should know this name, Emily Wenger. She's going to be write it down. She's going to be a faculty member at Duke this fall. And she created a tool as a part of a team at UChicago where they were thinking about artists and how artists are concerned about reuse of their pieces. They developed a tool where they can insert just a little additional information in those images when they go online, and it can allow the artist to control use and misuse of their images. And as we're talking, I'm thinking, wow, this seems really similar to questions in scientific publishing about misusing, repeating. You can think about it from another view. What if somebody, plagiarizes an image? That person who originally created it, what if they could insert just a little extra to make that easier to find? So you should Google Emily Wenger and glaze. She's going to be at Duke this fall. Super proud of her. And then wow, this would be a really neat thing to think about, how those kinds of tools could come together for the questions that are here among this group. The last thing I want to say is I am really just, again, so excited to be here. And it's so interesting to just be here and listen and learn in addition to sharing some things. And so I hope that you'll think more about what could continued crosstalk look like. I've been invited here. I do programming for the American Association of Physicists in Medicine for our annual meetings. Wow, we should invite publishers, not just to be a booth, but to actually maybe have a session or two. Would that be great? And to inject crosstalk occasionally could be really fruitful. So I hope it's helpful to you to hear some additional things I'm thinking about even past yesterday. And I hope to learn even more from the panel.
Thanks so much, Heather. And we're spelling Emily's name.
Wenger, Wenger, Emily Wenger.
Yeah, and she published in something in the New York Times. You were telling me that
her work was covered in the New York Times. Yeah.
Wow.
Just so proud, but it's a great tool too. So
excellent. Yeah. Thank you so much. Over to you, Stuart.
Right. Well, at Silverchair, we're giving a lot of thought to how AI, and specifically Gen AI, is likely to change the experience for end consumers of discovering and actually consuming content. We all know that LLMs are these kind of remarkable devices that kind of suck in all this information and can produce really compelling text that comes out of it. Got a great mastery of language. But one of the things that a lot of people are less aware of is that LLMs are just these enormous compression machines. They're compressing information with very lossy compression. So as you're putting this information in, actually it's very good at getting the essence of connections, like the gestalt of something, but they're not very precise. And you can actually really get a handle on this if you go and do some fine tuning. So I took on as a weekend exercise to try and educate an LLM about me. Because, I'm a technologist, I kind of like dark rooms, I don't have much of an internet presence. So most of these LLMs know nothing about me. But so I just fed in all this information about me. And what was interesting is that pretty quickly it started to get the essence of who I was. But even though I'd fed in all these facts about me, where I'd gone to school, different experiences that I'd had, it wasn't reliably spitting those facts out. What it was doing was spitting out facts that were pretty close to those facts. And that's kind of the part of the essence of, the brilliance of these things and also some of their real shortcomings. That unless something's really repeatedly trained on something, like if you want to get a citation about Einstein's, 1915, special relativity, or, one of those key papers, it'll be able to get that precisely because it's been trained so intensely on that. But when you're actually on the cutting edge of research, it's pretty approximate in that regard. And so one of the key patterns here is to actually have LLM on top of scholarly material. So that would be the retrieval augmented generation pattern. And that's what we're really focused on at Silverchair, to basically ground the LLMs in the content underneath it. But one of the real challenges here is with LLMs and RAG in particular is this notion of the jagged edge. So, from the outside, you come in and you're wowed with, the intelligence of these things. The thing is that intelligence doesn't perform evenly. Where you can ask certain questions, like in terms of a RAG system, if you're asking relatively straightforward questions on top of exceptionally high quality, dense reference material, it's just remarkable. It's like, wow, this is just amazing. But then if you start to get into a space where you're having an LLM go across, scholarly articles of varying quality, and maybe it's got to like synthesize a bunch of them together, it's got to reason about things like, date, it starts to break down pretty quickly. And so this is kind of like one of the real things that we're working with our clients on, is kind of really understanding what the jagged edges are. Because this technology is useful. People are using it. I mean, we saw yesterday that people are using ChatGPT very clearly in terms of what stuff they're submitting. And as LLM technology starts to get cooked into social media, into all these different venues, people are going to become increasingly comfortable using LLM technology. And it's incumbent on us to both adapt with that, but also to be able to educate us to where it works well and where it doesn't. And a great example of some of the edges, this is Perplexity. So Perplexity is arguably best in world at a RAG pattern on top of the internet currently. I use it a lot. I find it very, very helpful. But this is an example where I asked it a very specific question. You don't need to understand the actual context or read it, but about different encoding models. It's a technical question. And what it did was it conflated the latest model that I was asking about with a previous model, and then basically gave me a completely incorrect answer. But I've also had enough exposure to these things that I have a pretty good intuitive feel about what these things can answer right and what they can't. And basically what I do is I then just go in and kind of check the references. But this is going to be really important because there is going to be pressure to essentially provide these kind of conversational interfaces on top of scholarly material. And we need to be able to understand this because there are real trade-off considerations here, particularly around cost. Another thing I'll say is that, when we're speaking with clients, a lot of clients really feel like, I have to train a model. That's probably the last thing you want to do. It's really working down. This is kind of an inverted pyramid that really represents the common knowledge in the industry now. You're really working through around your retrieval mechanisms, going down to prompt engineering and maybe fine-tuning, probably only with embedding models. But actually trying to train your own model at this stage, it's not really something you want to be doing by and large. And what we're providing in terms of working with our clients, we've stood up a playground where you can actually get hands-on experience. Like, what does a conversational interface on top of your material look like? What's the experience of that? And to be able to kind of discover those jagged edges yourself, and to be able to swap out models. So going from the cheapest models to the most powerful, the most expensive. There's a whole lot of retrieval patterns under the covers, sophisticated agentic patterns that you can have where like an agentic pattern would be, you're asking a question, that question goes to the LLM kind of thinks about that, breaks it out into parts and goes off and tries to retrieve different bits, brings that information back and asks itself, should I be looking for more information? There's a whole world opening up around that. And this is really important that we take people on this journey to really understand the evolving nature of this technology. Because ultimately, people are going to, like I'm already, like I'm rarely now reading papers. Like I mostly read papers about, about RAG pattern and technology. But I'm rarely actually reading them myself now. I've got a number of kind of highly customized prompts and I'm just flipping things into LLMs. That's going to become increasingly the norm. And it's going to happen. It's either going to happen on our platforms or it's not, or it's going to happen somewhere else. And I think something really big gets lost if that happens somewhere else. And within all of this, there's a key consideration around cost, because serving this stuff up, at least currently, is probably 100 times the cost of just serving, a pretty static web page. There's also a lot of variability in there, so we're really about like being transparent, about what the actual token consumption costs are. And there's just real trade-offs here too in terms of model strengths. It's an amazing time in technology with just all these models dropping, just even in the last week. Oh my God. And there's a real price difference. So in terms of our playground, the differences between the models can be like up to 150 times. And you're really having to try and think about, what are the relative strengths of these models? What do you think about those companies? But also, what are the other limitations and how does it work with your specific content set? And so it's really important to understand what are you expecting users to do in a conversation on top of your content such that it actually benchmark against that. And this is just an example here where we've got our most expensive model and our cheapest model. On a simple question, actually the cheapest model does really well. There's not that much substantive difference, even though there's a 150 times cost difference between the two of them. So it actually is kind of important to really get a sense of this, because everybody's going to have to make economic choices about this. Everybody wants something that's at the highest bar at the lowest cost, and that doesn't exist. So it's trade-offs there. And lastly, I would say that we're all kind of waiting for this infallible oracle in the sky to appear, where we can just ask these LLMs or ask AI in general, and it will just reliably always give us like a great answer. We're not there today. That day where that really occurs, maybe that's a post-labor economic world anyway. Maybe humans aren't even driving the show at that point. That's some way off. And it's really thinking about where is the human in the loop with all this process. And when we think about simple scenarios like, say, generating lay abstracts, this is an area where a lot of publishers want to have really tight control over this, like generate all those lay abstracts, then let's send them back through an editorial process to make sure that they're all right. But that's just a very, very limited use case of AI. It gets much more interesting when it's interactive, where you can essentially be having it speak to you and your experience and really like drawing out the things that you're interested in. But the problem is it's just not practical for publishers to be the human in the loop at that point. So another part of this is really trying to educate our end users around the jagged edges of these technologies so that the end user can be the human in the loop in that regard. So that's what I had to speak about today.
Thanks very much, Stuart. A lot of food for thought there, and the pace of change, it seems to accelerate in so many parts of what we do in scholarly publishing, and of course, LLMs are right at the ragged edge, jagged edge, leading edge. Excellent, thank you. Last but certainly not least, of course, Chris, for the publisher's viewpoint.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much to everyone for being here and listening to us today. So to use a rugby term, I've got a bit of the hospital pass here. I'm sitting in front of a room of publishers, telling them how publishers should get to the future. How do we get to the future today? I'm not going to tell you exactly how to do that. There is no answer to that. But what I want to do is look a little bit into the past, actually. So, I've got an archaeologist by training, so I'm always digging through the past. Work at Science Magazine, I've got a great access to a fantastic historical record. And so rather than thinking about the technology per se, what I want to do a little bit is think about the problems. What are the problems actually we're trying to solve? And so looking back through the archive, this paper is from 1967, so 57 years ago. It's entitled The Future of Scientific Journals. And I think we'd all love to believe that the problems that this identifies have all been solved. So let's have a quick look. Have they been solved? Not really, no. So to go through these individually, so the first problem they identify is the volume of literature. There's actually a great quote in this paper. It's from 1613, where a scholar in those days is identifying, saying, there's far too much literature out there. What can I possibly do? So 400 years later, we still got the same problem. Speed of publication, same issue. Access and distribution, very hot right now. Well, it has been for the last decade or so, but it's still a problem that's identified in those areas. And of course, quality of research. This feeds very directly into discussion around AI, garbage in, garbage out, those sort of areas. Now, for an audience, I think, sitting here today, these are pretty boringly familiar, right? It's a little depressing to say in 57 years we've moved no further in solving any of these questions. I take a much more positive view on that, actually. I think these are just perennial issues. These are problems that can't be solved, but they can be improved upon, and they can be improved upon by scale. And I think, to build on some of the talks that I said earlier, I think we are at that pivotal point. There's a second digital transformation, an AI transformation, where actually we can move the pivot further towards solving these problems. I think the challenge is, of course, that we may exacerbate some of these problems. The scale of literature is whether it's going to get worse or better is a subjective view, but it's going to get larger with more and more AI models. So in terms of the kind of practical steps and thinking about what we can do, I think one of the things that I've really thought about today and then yesterday through the sessions is quite scary. There's a lot. I was thinking about Cynthia and Leo's presentation yesterday and looking at scenario planning. That was a fantastic presentation. Loved it that we've got these 4 scenarios, but how on earth do we kind of deal with them? How do we get our hands around them and grasp them and say, okay, we don't know what the world is going to be like in 10 years. We don't know what it's going to be like in 3 years, let alone that. It could be utterly unpredictable, and it could be incredibly disruptive. So what can we do in a more practical way? And I think the way I've been thinking about this more and more is a cultural change. It's the human factors that was identified in the trends piece. It's getting ourselves as publishers and the teams we work with and the researchers, the technologists, to say, okay, let's experiment, let's try a few things. One of the points I think I really want to emphasize is that when I think about this, I don't think about, and actually I think this is reflected in the trends as well, that move away from trends being called technology trends to just being trends, because everything is technology. We are all technologists now, and I think generative AI really, really emphasizes that point. So I think it rewards skills that are not just found in IT departments or technology centers, but are actually embedded deeply in publishing industry. It's things like clear communication, problem solving, be able to ask a question of an LLM in a way that actually it understands and can deliver you the answer you want. And I think, Stuart, you mentioned prompt engineering. Prompt engineering, I think, is undersold right now. When I think about, anecdotally, when I've had conversations with people who've used LLMs, they say, well, I wrote this very simple prompt and it gave me a garbage answer. It's like, well, I don't think the problem is actually the system and the answer, but you do need to treat it like as you would treat a human. One of the takeaways we had recently from an internal focus group, we brought some researchers in to talk about how they're using AI, how they're using LLMs. And they said and I think they meant this in actually a slightly disparaging way. They said it's like having an over-enthusiastic master's student. And I think actually that's a fantastic thing. If I could harness 100 over-enthusiastic master's students day to day in our business, I would love it. And so that's definitely the way that I'm thinking about it more. I think the last thing to say before we move to the questions and to kind of open up there is, what I've something found out internally is when we start to think about LLMs in a kind of practical way, in a day-to-day way, there's a sort of, again, this sort of paralysis. I think it's an incredibly transformative tool. We can do so much with it, but what is the big problem we really wanted to solve? I say, don't worry about the big problems. Try little things. I think Darren actually in his talk yesterday mentioned this really well. Looking at an old paper, taking a table, turning that into a figure. It's a very small but very useful use case. And I found actually on a day-to-day practical basis, looking at very small things, don't worry about that they're going to change the world, but actually say, oh, well, I want to take a table and I want to transform to this. I could do this myself in Excel, but it's going to take me 20 minutes. The machine can do this in 2, 1. So, and then you learn and iterate, and then I think the bigger things build on that. And at that, I'll stop and hand over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Chris. Lots of great food for thought there, and I really appreciate you're looking back at this article from 1967, and we, as in publishing, we constantly question ourselves, and it brought to mind what somebody once told me, that the first thing that was came off the printing press was the Bible. And the second thing was a treatise on the decline of the publishing industry. So, we do have this tendency to do those things, but it's really important to ground ourselves. So thank you to all of our panelists. The time now, we have about 25 minutes before lunch. So without further ado, questions and comments, anyone? Okay, so while you're thinking, I'll prime one. I think we heard about during the yesterday's session, and at least two of you have touched upon is how we consume content. And I think for a long time we thought about how we publish that content, and and how we get, we've made lots of improvements, and through persistent identifiers and lots of things which, when I started in science, they didn't have. But the focus we've had on how we consume content and how that might change really struck for me. And I just wonder if you had any comments about how you think that might change. And we've got a great, the three kind of people who can answer that question. So anybody have any comments about how you think that might change in the future?
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely going to be intermediated through LLMs. Like, as they get stronger and stronger and the patterns for information retrieval get stronger, it's just not going to make sense to go down to the actual literature other than kind of really fact-checking it. Exactly where that occurs, I think, is a really open question. I think it would be a little bit sad for the industry if all of this occurred on kind of major compute platforms, because I think a lot of value gets lost in the curation. But I think it's definitely coming.
I think something I'm excited about is how it will change functions of searching versus browsing. When you're looking for information, those are really two different approaches you take for different reasons. And I think it will really enlighten kind of what happens with both of those in some interesting ways. Searching often is thought as it can be a really linear path right now. But if you are then able to start a search and engage with a large language model on that, that's a really different vision. I'll give you a really practical example that I hope that this tool exists. But so I was trained in magnetic resonance, and there are these T1, T2 values of liquids that we are interested in. This is really kind of niche, but it was a really hard thing to collect. What are the known values of the T2 of muscles in humans, right? I mean, this was hard to track down, a comprehensive list. And I think back, wow, how much would that have facilitated and accelerated my learning if I could just have a tool that I could say, what are the known values for this, and do all that? Wow, it would have allowed me to work on a lot more interesting things at some point. So I think I'm excited about searching and browsing, how those two functions will change and expand, and then just really nitty-gritty things like searching for values comprehensively. It's going to be amazing.
And I think, kind of building off that, I think we're going to see within the next couple of years, 5 years at the outside, that the LLMs become reliable enough in instruction following that agent networks really become a thing, and kind of potentially agent swarms, where it becomes practical to do things like a literature review. So you're really able to have these LLMs. You're going to have to be working with it to kind of be a human in the loop as it kind of breaks down its thought chain and its essentially research structure. But similar to somebody you might be supervising, and you're actually having to nudge it here and nudge it there. But I think that's going to open up a lot to basically go out and really be foraging, and just you're increasingly passing off more and more of the heavy lifting to these algorithms.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think this has the potential to be incredibly disruptive. I think something that Darren was talking about again yesterday in his fantastic talk, where you say, okay, and this actually alludes to what Todd was saying earlier with these point versus platform kind of questions. I think it's easy for us to say, oh, well, with lay summaries, well, when we're thinking about this internally, say, okay, we'll put a lay summary, we'll use AI to do that, or we'll do some speech, text-to-speech and do that. It kind of misses sometimes the wood for the trees. Actually, will people even be coming to our platforms? Because, Stuart, you mentioned Perplexity. Perplexity is fantastic. And I think, it's fantastic now. 2 years, 3 years, it's going to be so much better than it is. And so do actually people who come to our websites at all. And I think, that's frankly very scary, right? Because our businesses are built around people coming and reading on our sites. And so that's the big question mark, I think, within publishing is actually, and with researchers, are we cut out the loop? And how do we prevent that happening? Or how do we work with others to be part of that process?
Thank you. Great answers. I have Robert.
Yes, thank you. Robert Harrington from the American Mathematical Society. And I think maybe you're already touching on this, but I'm actually really interested to ask you about curation a bit more. Is that our future? At this table earlier, we were talking about how some of this technology is coming at us as opposed to something we're generating, and that our role might be in how we interpret that, we validate it, we curate it. Is that our future? And if so, can you sort of think about what that may mean in terms of the sorts of role that we have as publishers. Because I kind of am thinking about that curation aspect more than almost anything else. And also in the curation and perhaps embedded in history. Each generation has created something durable through our, so the idea that we build things that last is curation related to that idea of things that we build that will last through next generations as well.
Yeah, I think curation is just incredibly important, particularly when we think about RAG, the retrieval augmented generation pattern, which is what Perplexity is using and what you use to essentially connect LLMs and kind of ground them in content. That pattern is only as good as the text chunks that are retrieved. So this is using, the in-context learning capabilities of LLMs, where you're kind of feeding it information just in time and it's learning from that. And one of the things that we find is, particularly if you're going across a really large corpus of information that may go back many, many years, like if you went back far enough, you might ask a question about some medical condition and you might get an answer that bloodletting is appropriate. And so that's where it really is important to figure out and curate what the LLMs actually get to see. So I think it's actually really, really critical, and it's picking up all those signals and really having that editorial thumbprint on what is the highest quality information.
It brings to mind the role of domain experts in this process. And again, we see this in AI of medical imaging. Because you can do things all day long with an image and you can get good things, but you really need the role of a domain expert in medical imaging to make that AI tool use meaningful and helpful and curate what's happening. So I don't know what it looks like to include domain experts in what you're asking in that curation, because there's domain expertise into like technology of platforms, but there's also, do you have somebody in that field who's making the call and training that LLM? That sounds expensive to me, and surely to you guys too, but I think domain expertise is really important in curation.
Yeah, I think to finish, when I think about curation, I also think about brands, right? And I think we can use, this is straying into some, I'm sure people disagree in some ways, but brands are shortcuts and assumptions to certain things. So you can say, so I work for Science. If a paper is published in Science, you can assume a certain set of things about that paper. There's not going to be 100% true all the time, but as a set of assumptions, as a kind of heuristic shortcut, you're able to do that. And I think that's where that could be a difference. I think those brands will, sometimes I think we get caught up as industry in the vessels, right? So thinking about the journal as it is, as a collection of articles, how it's evolved, when actually, maybe we need to start thinking about not just the article level, but actually the brand itself and what that tells people about it. And so when we're going to a Perplexity as a good example, that actually it does set a set of references. There's someone to say, well, this reference is from Science, this reference is from, I don't want to disparage anyone, so it's from this journal, and you can make a different set of assumptions about the information it brings. I think that is directly linked to the curation aspect as well. How that's monetized, I think is a challenge, but yeah, I think there's hope there.
Absolutely. I have a question from our colleague here.
Yeah. Hi. So this just to follow up on your comments about browsing versus researching literature review and curation. How do you see subscription-based or the paywall versus the open access to affect all what you have commented on what AI can do with it? Thanks.
Can I be really honest? This is a safe space. When you think about, let's say I'm sitting down to follow a thread on citations, somebody's developed something really new. I want to kind of track back, where did it come from and who else has been working on it? You hit the paywall, you ask a friend to get the article for you. That's just the reality of what happens, right? In some ways, I think it's a very positive comment about the strength of communities among scientists, right? We want to help each other, but we are getting around those things. And then on the other hand, though, I can understand it from a publisher's perspective, why there are firewalls and why, when your institution's library commits to subscribing to those resources, it says a lot, right? There's a lot there. So I don't have an answer to that, but I just wanted to throw in the realistic answer about how it's currently working. And I think that those two positives are what to focus on. And then again, yesterday I want to give a really big caveat. The funding model question I know is important, and I just don't have a lot of experience and insight to that. But if I I'll speak to SPIE and how great it is to have the publications committee, because it really gives me, as a researcher, a growing knowledge of those funding models. And as my knowledge has grown, it's made me a little bit more aware about what's happening when, easy for me to ask a friend for an article, but I know there's more happening there. So I think it speaks to the strengths of including researchers in those questions. And I'll stop there because I guess I've just, revealed that we get around things pretty easily. That's the reality. So.
Okay, Chris, just
Yeah, hi, Chris Shillam from Orchid. Pulling together a few of your comment threads, if we believe the assumption that the underlying human-created, curated literature is no longer the entry point for consumers of research, but it's critical both for the RAG process, for the training of large language models, how do we maintain the incentives for that content to continue to be created? Easy question.
any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have an answer. There we go. But that's my get out clause. But I think it goes back a little bit to this gentleman's question around as well. Is I think there's and to go back to that question a little bit and to kind of answer yours in passing, I think is there is an optimistic scenario, and I think there's many optimistic scenarios and many pessimistic scenarios. One of the optimistic scenarios, thinking from a science perspective, is okay. Well, actually, we have very high quality content. Most of it is not open access. There is a scenario where, and I think this happened with Wiley recently. They did a great big deal with an AI company. That AI company says to us, "We want your content. We'll pay for it, and we'll license it, and we make our money that way." The pessimistic way is, are we really big enough? If we're not in, let's say Perplexity is the next Google. If we're not in there, does that harm us more than it harms them? Probably, actually, and even as a big brand like Science, that's probably true. And so, I think time will only tell, actually, and working, obviously, I think, again, to pick on Todd yet again, going and talking to those people and talking and helping them understand the importance of what we do, that actually they can't just train, well, they can, and they do, can't just train it on Reddit, but they need other sources. And I think there's emerging areas like Mistral as an LLM, which is showing that higher quality content going in really yields better results. And so that's my positive view, that actually, maybe our customer base does change. That there's lots of risks within that, but there is, I think there's a positive case within it.
I think it's really interesting to reflect upon, as publishing modes have changed, what happens, how are we accessing those things from 200 years ago, right? And then think today, what are we producing? How will it be accessed? The today, how will it be accessed in the future? And then the question is, how will future things be accessed, right? And I think when we think about knowledge as even epistemology, like really philosophical, right? It's really important to maintain access to those. And so what I would share just from a research perspective is I am reaching back to those 200-year-old articles to tell my students, this is how this field has changed. Like James Clerk Maxwell, for example, I reach back into his materials as primary sources to teach my students. So I would just share that happens among researchers. You should know that happens. And then it's this future versus now. Let's not discount what is even happening now that will be reviewed in the future. It's not only about the transitions we're about to make, but what is now will be used in the future. And so I would emphasize those from my experience.
Do we have any more questions from, we have one.
Hi,
Hi
Heather
there.
Staines from Delta Think. We talked about consuming content. I want to kind of back up a little bit to the creation of content. It wasn't that long ago, just a few, maybe 3, 4, 5 months ago, where there was almost like a plagiarism, I'll call it like hysteria, around the time the president from Harvard was forced to resign. And I think it made a lot of us think back how careful were we 30 years ago when we wrote our dissertations. And so in that case, I think, plagiarism tools were kind of weaponized, and there are differences between writing a literature review, which can only be done in so many creative ways, versus where you're actually plagiarizing like an idea without giving credit. So I'm wondering, when teaching researchers to write, students, but also as they become researchers, where they're going to be using these tools, and one, they may not be aware that the tools themselves may well be plagiarizing or not citing in ways that they should be. But you know, on the other hand, you know, how did they understand the difference? And when we're looking at that content between, there's only so many ways to write a literature review versus something that's nefarious and actually stealing an idea. So again, how do we kind of navigate that space for them?
I think two things I would want you to know about that. Sometimes speaking about what to avoid is just a really different conversation than giving just a few key phrases of what to work towards. And I have found actually the term intellectual contribution, I just repeat that ad nauseum because that's really what plagiarism is about, I think. And so just setting in mind for anybody, I mean, even, you know, credentialed researchers, trainees, whatever, just talking all the more about intellectual contribution and what it means as a flexibility. It doesn't matter what platform it is, right? If you're plagiarizing an intellectual contribution, it's a problem, and that can look like many things. But it sets the ideal of what am I doing in the first place? I'm trying to make an intellectual contribution. So I would just say that sometimes setting a vision and a simple term can really add clarity to what it is and what it isn't. And then I would say on the other hand about the friction question, when I heard the case about the Harvard president, I mean, I was just thinking so much about how easy it is to lose track of a word for word citation when you're just putting together a document. It is so easy to lose the quotation marks around it. You know, it's so easy, let alone the nefarious plagiarism. And so I don't know the details about her situation, but it just really made me feel like our tools are not great for tracking our aggregating knowledge base for something like that in the first place. And then, you know, explicit plagiarism is a whole different issue. So those are two things I would say is one is setting the vision for what intellectual contribution it is, making sure people are on the same page about it, and then just practical tools to facilitate avoiding those issues.
I think it's also going to get really interesting as LLMs become stronger. We have the sparks of it today, but particularly across like interdisciplinary fields, like these things are good at kind of making these connections that humans aren't often going to make. And what you don't know is, like, was this just a novel connection that the LLM created on its own, or was it actually directly exposed to that idea previously? So, like, particularly in the realm of law, like, there was a lot of concern originally about hallucinations, and that's still a really big issue. But they've actually started to discover that the more powerful LLMs, those hallucinations can actually lead to really novel strategies that actually haven't been tested yet. And so I think there's going to be this increasingly difficult thing where the LLM kind of gives you these really interesting trailheads to explore, but you don't know if you're plagiarizing. And well, do you actually give credit to the LLM? You know, so it's probably a thing of trying to come behind and try and figure out, like, has that, you know, been explored anywhere? So probably using an LLM to try and get that attribution.
Yeah, very interesting. And the thought popped into my head. You know, I read about the hallucinations and in that they've been productive, and maybe we should be renaming LLMs as LSD. I don't know. I think we have time for one more question if there is, and we have. Where are we? Please, who's our questioner? Oh, hi, please.
Hi, I'm Paul G. from JAMA. I have a question around, there's an us and them that I feel like we're saying, like there's all of us publishers with all this content that I think we're saying hasn't necessarily been consumed by the big Silicon Valley LLMs. Do you, and this kind of goes back to Stuart, you're saying it's better for us to start at the top with the RAG models rather than training the LLM. But is this the time to kind of discuss like what it would mean if there was an LLM trained on all of our content together before it's handed off to Google, OpenAI, like all the big players? And what does that mean to have that discussion?
Yeah, my personal view is that it's actually quite important for publishers to figure out a way to get the highest quality content into these LLMs. But just getting the content in there doesn't solve for hallucinations. But I think these LLMs are going to increasingly like influence everything. Like our children are going to be interacting with these LLMs. We want them to be as kind of grounded in hard science and kind of research as we can, because Reddit, you know, like Reddit's just not the most reliable source of things. But I also think there's there's the obvious tension of how do you actually get compensated for that. But I also suspect that in the coming years, what's going to happen is that, a lot of publishers are going to find their way to get compensated and get their material into those LLMs. And then you're going to have some large publishers that are just not represented in there. And I think that there's the potential for that to become known that, oh, you want to be an influential researcher? If you're with these publishers, you get your material in there, and that material is actually influencing the LLMs. It's indirect influence, but quite pervasive. Versus, oh, you go with this publisher, and there's a real ring fence around it. I think it's a complex issue, and I don't have a great answer to it, other than I think it's really important to try and get that information in there. Even with it in there, RAG's still really important.
Any further questions? Well, if not, I have one thing which is probably not going to be able to get into 4 minutes, but at the discussion session earlier at our table, one of the items that came up with something, which you just said, Stuart, which just reminded me of it, was around, we haven't talked anything about kind of copyright and how things are used and how publishers get compensated for that. And, I had in my mind a vision, we're here in DC, of at some point in the future of big tech people in front of a congressional committee, talking about these things. I don't know if we have any thoughts about, what are the rights and wrongs of that situation, because, and it's interesting also with copyright holders, especially in the case of CC BY and so on and so forth, how all that gets worked out. So you got 3 minutes, Chris. Go.
Gosh, yeah. So I mean, it's what's my get out clause? It's an evolving situation, right? We'll have to look at the court cases of the New York Times, and others. My probably overly reductionist view is the ship has sailed. I don't think the genie is going back in the lamp. I don't think the cork's going back in the bottle. I can't see a world where suddenly, maybe again I'm naive on this. The US government comes charging after the big AI companies and says, take all of this out. I think the advantages are too big to the world as a whole, and the advantages, nationally are too big to those countries involved as well for that to happen. And so that's fairly pessimistic from a publisher perspective. I appreciate that, but maybe I'll leave it there. It's kind of too reductionist, but it's a reductionist view.
Really like to thank our panelists, Heather Stewart and Chris. It's been a wonderful to have you all here. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for your questions. And let's have a round of applause for the panel.